Hello, everybody. My name is Wendy, and I'm a grateful, recovering compulsive eater. I weigh and measure my food from the gray sheet, write it down, committed to my sponsor. Don't eat in between except for coffee, tea, or diet soda, and abstinence is the most important thing in my life without exception. Being at a meeting like this is among the most important things in my life, too. I need meetings to, they say, keep me green, keep the memory there, and just to know I'm not alone because this is a very hard task, staying abstinent. So I read my story. I'm sorry for that. I grew up in Chicago in the 1950s. I was a middle child in a barely observant Jewish family. And we had a warm and loving family life that centered around movies, television, baseball, and food. And most of the members of my immediate and extended family were overweight, and our holiday and birthday get togethers centered on food and gossip about who had gained weight and how much they had gained. And during my adolescence, I was generally 5 to 15 pounds overweight. I was shy and I daydreamed a lot. I spent a lot of my time reading girl books, including Nancy Drew, Cherry Ames, and the Dana Girls. Now, they were never overweight and they were always very smart and disciplined. And I also watched television and went to movies, and I saw people like Jane Fonda and Julie Christie. And I usually ate food not on our food plan while engaged in these activities and also while reading. And when I wasn't watching a movie, I fantasized about a future in which I would be like them. But watching movies and TV were not the path to becoming these types of women. I was out of shape and lumpy. I was terrible in gym and did not engage in any type of athletics. I had little interest in clothes, and I didn't know my clothes size until I was in my 20s. I didn't even know about petites till I was in my 40s. I never knew what to do with my hair, and I didn't care much about makeup because it didn't cover the extra weight I carried. Although I received a lot of recognition for being smart early on, I found doing homework increasingly difficult, especially as the work became more complex. I'd end up finishing in the morning, dropping books and papers on the way out. And I think I had ADD or ADHD from an early age. And even though I got good grades, when I started having to write papers, I began to freak out and my grades began to slip. And these struggles continued through high school and college. And also in college, I added to this, I began binging. I had never done this before, and it was new behavior for me. And I also would go on a diet, and I would feel so wonderful. And I'd be on the diet for about 3 months, and then I'd have this urge to eat something sweet, and I couldn't resist it. And usually I'd be binging for a while, and then I'd even out. In 1971, I graduated from college, which was in Central Illinois, and I received a B plus average, which was considered way below my potential. Most of my classmates were going to law school, medical school, or graduate school. I didn't think I was qualified to do anything. And I moved back to my parents' house in Chicago, got a clerical job, and joined Weight Watchers for the first and only time. As always happened when I dieted, the weight loss lasted 2 to 3 months, and then I began to climb in my weight. And this time I think I went up to 150, getting close to wearing a size 18. I'm about 5'3", fairly small bone. Now, I made plans to go to California with some college friends, which was a bizarre choice. I had no desire to go to the West Coast. I didn't know what I was doing with my life. I had no sense of who I was. And I ended up not going because the night before, I don't know how many of you know what the New Left is, but the New Left friend of one of the people who was going told me I was a useless human being because I wasn't involved in a protest movement. I had no purpose in life. So after a superficial attempt to kill myself, I got on a Greyhound bus that was going to Boston, and I'd always wanted to move to the East Coast. And I was 21 years old. And I spent most of my 20s working as a secretary in Boston. I enjoyed one of my jobs, which was as an administrative assistant at the outpatient alcoholism clinic. I worked there for about 6 years, or actually even longer. I'd never identified with the disease of alcoholism. I hadn't known any people who were alcoholics when I was younger. But I remember thinking, if this were food, I would not be able to give it up. It was the only way I was able to identify with them. And not being in school or a professional job allowed me the time to enter into therapy. Oh, you know what? I forgot to put my timer on. All right, well, I'll figure this out. And develop my personality, acquire more friends, and improve my wardrobe and appearance. And I also began to develop my intellectual side. But, I still fell into deep depressions, and I was put on antidepressants, but I believed at the time they had no chance to work when I was overeating. So there was a connection between who I was and my overeating. Every time I was overeating, I sort of felt like there was no way for me to change. And in 1980, at age 30, I worked my way into a professional job and went on my last diet. Went through the same thing, 20-pound weight loss. I was the happiest person in the whole world. I loved the way I looked. But then I went off of it, and my weight was climbing. And this time it wasn't going to go back down. I just spent all of my time eating, and I'd go to a restaurant and bring my binge food there because I got lonely being home alone eating. I learned about OA from a newspaper article, and so I didn't know anything about 12-step groups, and I started attending meetings in Boston. I couldn't stay abstinent. There was something similar to the gray sheet. One day, a slim young woman named Marcia spoke at the noon OA meeting and described a program that for several years had allowed her to maintain a normal weight and to live a disciplined life. I asked her to be my sponsor. She said she couldn't, but she has come to the Cambridge meeting on Saturday morning in that church at Harvard Square. That meeting, it changed my life. I had never had hope. I had always planned on killing myself. I was beyond, I always thought I was going to do it at 25. Well, at this time I was 30. But I thought I was a hopeless human being. But I heard by the people who were qualifying and sharing, a lot of them had the same shameful traits that I had, underperforming intellectually, being disorganized, feeling lazy. But they had begun to shed these traits at the same time they began eating 3 weighted and measured meals a day from the gray sheet with nothing in between. Now, in spite of the fact that I finally had hope, it took me 2 years to be able to do what they suggested. And that's because I didn't understand what no matter what meant. And I think, my family, we never learned to do things that were demanding. If something was difficult, as a group, we would just give up and go out to eat or something like that. I didn't know what it was like to do something difficult. So I left the program, and over the next 2 years, I hit new bottoms. I locked myself into my office building. I moved out of my apartment, rented it to somebody else, and stayed with friends. People thought I was crazy. Why would I do that? I made a superficial attempt to kill myself again. I was seen by a psychiatrist specializing in eating disorders at Mass General Hospital. I said to her, I need to return to this thing called Gray Sheet. And I pledged I would go to 7 meetings the following week. And finally, I think I got what no matter what meant. And I realized that the program would have to be the focus of my whole life. I quit my professional job and got a typing job, a half-time job near Harvard Square, so I'd be close to meetings. And I did 90 meetings in 90 days. On the weekend, I went to 5 meetings. I didn't own a car, and I would take public transportation. And it would take me a long time, but I loved it because I enjoyed reading. eating. Although I was an atheist, I asked God on my knees for a day of abstinence in the morning and thank God each night for my abstinence. The process was agonizing. I still, I think it was day 4. I was just on the verge of eating. I went to the grocery store and I put the food back from my cart. And I always remember people saying, you haven't lost your abstinence until you put the food in your mouth. And that really helped me. And that agonizing process of getting abstinent, it was so important because it helped me, first of all, for the first time in my life, I was eating the same every day. I was never able to do the same thing every day. I was following a routine, and it just I couldn't believe it. All right. And so I began to like myself for the first time, thinking I didn't have to kill myself. And over time, so I was abstinent. After a year and a half, I joined an AWOL for a year, and it seemed sort of weird, but I began to understand the steps. I read the big book, which I really loved. I went back and I went back to graduate school, and with the help of some GreySheeters, began to getting over my writer's block. Well, after 3.5 years in Cambridge, I moved back to Chicago, where my family was. And I was complacent at the time. And I joined How because I didn't want to weigh and measure in restaurants. I was actually successful in not putting on weight and sort of staying absent for about 8 to 10 years. And so instead of weighing, I would say and I stopped having I actually got left How. I was doing it on my own. So I'd say I'll have 1 can of this or something like that. And my weight actually stayed stable. But sometime during this point, I picked up an extra fruit. And from that point on, probably about 2010, and then it became harder and harder. I began to put on weight, but I wasn't binging and I wasn't eating sweets or things like that. And then I retired and I moved to Arkansas where my brother and sister-in-law lived. When I moved here, I started to binge on abstinent foods. Just, I didn't stop, and my weight really went up fast. Somebody didn't recognize me after meeting me 2 weeks earlier. And I knew, first of all, I had to go back to Gray Sheet, and well, there was no other program. And so first I called Overeaters Anonymous, I think. I didn't know about phone meetings, but I discovered phone meetings. And I heard them talking about God and everything. And then I called Gray Sheet and I heard people say the mantra. And I knew I was in the right place. So this time around, that was 10 years ago, I got abstinent February 21st, 2016. It has been so wonderful since then. I mean, because it wasn't as difficult the first time getting abstinent because I hadn't gotten into the sweets yet. I don't think I'd ever come back if I had gotten into the sweets. And I just knew that I never wanted to leave the program, and I was going to make it really be the major thing in my life. And I have other things in my life. I'm able to have the scholarship I had always wanted. That is the miracle for me. My brain began to work well as a result of doing this program. And when I tell you that, I mean, not only am I not suicidal, but I've become about 2/3 of the person I would like to be. What a miracle this program is. So with that, I'll pass and say thank you for listening to my story.